Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture where we talk about Central Americans, the last Latinx group that we'll be discussing this semester. So hopefully by now you've noticed the pattern of what are the questions that we are looking at when we are trying to understand the history of different Latinx groups in the United States. And these are generally the questions that we ask. Why did they come? Where do they settle, and what are their settlement experiences like? What kinds of challenges do they experience, and how do they respond or resist to these challenges, for example, through their forms of organizing? And I'm sure if you go back and look at the different groups we've talked about this semester, you'll see that the content has been responding to these questions throughout the semester. Now here I've included a map of Central America because we don't tend to be very familiar with Central America or have a sense of which are the countries that pertain to Central America, how large are they, where are they? And so you can see there what the different countries are that belong to Central America. And while we have in the United States, populations from all of those countries, including Panama and Costa Rica and Belize, the larger populations since the 80s in particular have been coming from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, where many of the issues that we'll be discussing today have been taking place, in particular since the 1980s. So the reading talked a little bit about the early history of this region, where the indigenous communities have consistently throughout their history been experiencing displacement from their lands by Spanish colonizers for their own riches, and more recently by U.S. economic interests. As the agriculture focused on a particular crop for world economy, particularly coffee, we see an increased displacement taking place of workers and the movement of people within these countries. The United States becomes influential after these countries achieve their independence from Spain during the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly through companies like the United Fruit Company, which serve as a vehicle for U.S. To influence local politics and the economy, but it also ends up creating a connection between the United States and this region, where many of the early migrants that come from Central America are being transferred from U.S. companies that they worked for in Central America, or as domestics for the owners of these corporations when they decide to return to the United States. The civil wars that start taking place in the late 1970s result from a rise of unrest between leftists and workers against political conservatives and elites. The governments begin to turn to violent repression of leftists, labor organizers, university students, and so on, using extreme measures such as assassinations, kidnappings, and torture. The Catholic Church begins to get involved, as during this time period, there are sectors of the Catholic Church that begin to preach what is known as liberation theology. The fundamental idea that poverty and oppression were not God's will, and that God's children had the right to challenge oppressive institutions, structures, and conditions in every sector of society. And so many Catholic priests throughout this region begin to preach from this idea of liberation theology, including Oscar Romero in El Salvador, who becomes targeted for assassination and is killed in 1980 while saying mass at the cathedral where he presided. This results in the United States in what was known as the sanctuary movement, where churches here were outraged at the fact that churches weren't safe places in Latin America, that a bishop could be targeted for assassination. And so this movement began in the United States through churches to help the Central American immigrants that were starting to arrive, who were fleeing the unrest in their countries. Churches opened their doors to these immigrants, providing sanctuary so that they would not be deported. And it also helped raise awareness among non-Latino churchgoers about what was happening in Central America. Soon, other institutions like universities declared themselves sanctuary spaces. And finally, the city of Los Angeles itself did the same. Church protection was perceived as both a political and religious act, and was seen as fulfilling the biblical mandate to welcome strangers among you. 8 of the sanctuary activists, however, were arrested and convicted on 16 felonies. This, of course, only led to further radicalizing of churches in the United States and for the sanctuary movement to spread. And the sanctuary movement, we saw a return of this movement during the Trump administration, where once again, particularly undocumented immigrants were being targeted through his administration. And you might recall seeing churches, cities, universities, and different institutions offering sanctuary to undocumented immigrants that were under threat of deportation. Now, as a result of the pressure from the sanctuary movement and the awareness that begins to be increased, there are important legal cases that start taking place that provide rights for Central American immigrants that are arriving seeking asylum. One of these cases was the Orantes Hernandez versus Smith case, which brought attention to the harassment and abuse being experienced by detainees at detention centers, where they were kept while their cases were pending. Officials harassed individuals and at times gave them misinformation that dissuaded them from applying for asylum in the United States. The case made visible the fact that detainees were encouraged to accept what officials called voluntary deportation instead of undergoing an asylum hearing, where they were told that if they chose a hearing, they could end up in detention for a long period of time and could not return for 5 years if there was a negative decision. So there was a lot of misinformation that was being given to these detainees about what their rights were in terms of applying for asylum or not. The American Baptist Church versus Thornburg case, which is known as the ABC case, made the argument of the unfairness of denying asylum cases and led to the reopening of thousands of asylum cases that had been previously denied. So what was happening was that compared to other groups of the immigrants that were also seeking asylum, the number of cases that were accepted where Central Americans were given asylum was tiny compared to the amount of asylum cases that were accepted by other groups that were coming. And so this case, the point of this case was to point out this discrepancy between some groups being given asylum and other groups being denied asylum, particularly Central Americans. And so the case found that there was a discrepancy and required that thousands of these cases that had originally been denied to be reopened. And while these cases were reopened and pending, these folks did not have to be deported and were allowed to stay in the United States. As a result of these cases and the continued pressure of the sanctuary movement in the 1990s, the temporary protected status is created for these folks. The TPS was provided to immigrants fleeing from certain countries for whom returning home would be unsafe due to either armed conflict, environmental disaster, or other extraordinary circumstances. TPS would be given for a limited period of time during which individuals were provided with work authorization. So they were allowed to work here legally. This status wasn't indefinite, however, and at the end of a certain period, the US government would have to decide whether to extend TPS or not. And that has been the case for decades, where TPS continues to be extended for certain populations until the Trump administration, where there was a threat that TPS was going to be taken away to Central American and other populations that had been in the United States for 20 years. This was fortunately overturned once the Biden administration came on board. But again, this is another population that is vulnerable because they do not have a permanent status in the United States. These communities have created their own organizations over the years. So one of the major ones is called the Central American Refugee Center, or CARECEN, which provides legal counseling, food distribution, English literacy training, and so on. Another is CISPES, Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. There is the Guatemala Information Center. And many of the groups that come, particularly from places like Guatemala, are actually indigenous Mayan populations who have also created their own organizations, like Canjoval, which organize cultural organizations and address their needs in their particular indigenous languages. And that's something that has been starting to complicate some of the assumptions we make about who the Latino population is in the United States, where often we assume that they all speak Spanish. Well, many of these populations, particularly the Mayan groups coming from places like Guatemala, Spanish is not their first language. It's actually their second language. If they speak Spanish at all, many are coming speaking their indigenous languages. So that has required that many of the immigrant assistance organizations that exist in places like Los Angeles, where a lot of these populations have settled, need to rethink, right? How do they provide assistance to these groups if they do not speak Spanish or English? And it also means that we have become more and more aware of the indigenous elements within Latin America that are now showing up in the United States. Now, there are different work experiences that this population has had, and different areas that they tend to concentrate in, particularly in places like Los Angeles. One area for work that these folks have concentrated in has been the garment industry. However, in this industry, there are poor working conditions, low paid work, working in subcontractor shops. They take long hours to complete projects. Some have to do piecework, where they take work to complete at home, and they're paid by the piece, not by the hour. They're vulnerable to what is called stitch and ditch phenomenon, where garment industry shops leave overnight, particularly when threatened with unionization of their workers. And then people show up to work the next morning, the shop is closed, everything is gone. And not only are they left without employment, but they're left without whatever paycheck was owed to them as well. This also has been known as being a difficult labor force to unionize because of this constant shift and movement. But one of the organizations that has been created that has been successful at trying to organize this population is called Unite. And unions have taken new tactics like providing education on immigrant rights as a way to recruit these laborers and become unionized. Another area where you see many of these folks working is in janitorial services. This, however, is an easier workforce to unionize because they are pretty consistent in terms of where they're working. And so it makes it easier for labor organizers to approach them, talk to them about their worker rights, their immigrant rights, and that they do have rights to unionize even if they are undocumented. The reading talked about strategies by building companies to contract non-union cleaning service agencies, and the strategies by union leaders to recruit immigrant workers. One of these unions and movements is called Janitors for Justice, which has been a successful campaign to force companies to hire union workers. And the increase in this has taken in places like Los Angeles, where a lot of these large buildings that have office spaces, they subcontract to different companies for who's going to clean up, right, their offices, and who's going to vacuum their floors and take out the trash and that kind of stuff. And so part of the challenge has been that some of the building owners that subcontract to get this kind of service are avoiding unionized workers And so part of the fight is to fight against those business or those building owners to get them to hire specifically companies, janitorial service companies that have workers that are unionized. Another area in which particularly women experience work or find work is as domestic workers. This kind of labor force is extremely isolated, making them vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, often because they are either traveling for hours on buses to get to the more upscale neighborhoods where they work, or they are live-in domestics. So they are working and living in the place where they work. And sometimes their employers don't make a distinction between when their work hours end and when they are available to do work, because they are living inside of their own homes. They're traveling great distances to get to work from their neighborhoods. And because of these factors, it is a difficult labor force to unionize. So labor organizers have to become very strategic and creative in terms of how do they target these women to try to teach them about their rights and so on. And one of the ways that they've been doing this was to target bus stops where these women are very early in the morning, congregated, waiting for their buses to get to the neighborhoods where they work. One of the aspects of this particular population has been this idea of transnationalism, where these families are not just arriving to the United States and sort of, Americanizing and creating communities here and so on, but are very much still connected to their home countries. And so this takes place through a number of different ways. One is through the role of hometown organizations, where people organize, these hometown clubs based on what town they're coming from, let's say in El Salvador. And so they'll create a hometown organization here, consisting of people who are from that same town in El Salvador, and use these clubs to not just create a sense of community for themselves in the United States, but also as a way to raise funds to contribute to their towns back home. Economic remittances is another way in which these communities maintain close ties. Many of them are split families where the parents and some of the children are here and some of the children are still back home. And so when they work here, they're not just working to sustain themselves here in the US, but they're also sustaining households back home where they're sending money for their children, for their school uniforms, for their school supplies, food, and also to help whatever adults are there taking care of the children. Through these economic remittances, that they contribute to development projects in Central America. Many of them have been able to create parks, build schools, and so on in some of their towns through their fundraising. And often many of these Central American countries are encouraging immigrants to invest in their home countries. Now, when you look at the importance of this economic investment from immigrants to the Central American countries, you'll see that a large percentage of the economies of these countries depend now on these economic remittances and economic investment by Central American immigrants in the United States. One of the elements of this particular population, again, as a result of the civil wars that they survived and fled, is this idea of silence and trauma. There is silence and trauma surrounding the history of violence that many of these Central American immigrants experienced. Many of these folks were only able to flee after experiencing torture or witnessing loved ones being killed. There's also a silence as a form of survival during these wars and in the US, where they don't talk about their experiences. There's also silence around the US involvement in these civil wars. The reason why many of these asylum cases were initially denied was because the United States was providing funding and training to the governments of some of these countries, like in El Salvador and Guatemala, to fight against the leftists. And so because of that, these countries, these governments were allies of the United States. And so if we had given them asylum, it would be admitting that our contributions weren't helping in these civil wars, and that we were, in essence, contributing to the violence that these folks were experiencing. There's also a lot of silence around these immigrants being refugees and not illegal immigrants. And so the terms that we use with these populations is significant, right? If you just call them illegal immigrants or economic immigrants, then you're suggesting that these people are leaving these countries and it is their personal choice. Whereas when you call them refugees, these are people who are forced to flee in order to save their lives, right? So what terms we use really is important in identifying the realities that are being experienced. One of the things that are more recently impacting many of these countries now are gangs, where in the 1990s, many of the civil wars ceased through different agreements between the governments and the leftist groups. What we have seen now more since the 2000s is the impact of gangs. And that has been a result of our deportation policies, where many of these young people who were a part of gangs in the United States and were imprisoned, we deport them if they're not American citizens, and we send them back to Central America. And so when these young men are returning, they end up recreating the same gangs that they were part of here in Central America. And so this increases and becomes a significant problem, where some of the violence now that people are fleeing is not from leftist or guerrilla warfare or any of our government repression, but it's from gangs. And this is a part of the issue, is that you are having these like teenage boys or young men in their 20s who all they've ever known is the United States. They are imprisoned and therefore deported because they came to the United States when they were very young. And now these young people are being returned to Central America, countries that they're not familiar with and may not necessarily speak Spanish. They can't find employment, they don't have access to education. And so all they know is the life they left behind, which was a life with their gang. And so that results in the recreation of these situations throughout Central America. One of the organizations that is trying to do something about that is called Homies Unidos, and there are different branches of this organization, including here in Denver, where they are trying to, where they exist both in the US and in countries in Central America, where they are trying to work with members of gangs or former members of gangs to help them get access to education, get employment skills, and so on, to be able to leave the gang life. One of the other things during the Obama era in particular that we heard about was the increase in child immigrants and their arrival through this train called La Bestia. And so you may recall hearing about this sudden crisis of children migrating by themselves from Central America. Many of them are teenage boys, and they're leaving because they're fleeing now the gang violence. part of the crisis is that they were traveling on top of these trains that was also often called the death train. And as you can see, how they're traveling on top of these trains, this is very dangerous. Many of them are also being abused, taken advantage of, experiencing being thefts and so on. And so this required or pushed the Obama administration to come up with some solution. And the solution was the Central American Minors Program, which allowed for children in Central America who had parents in the US to petition for refugee resettlement interviews before making the journey to the US. The program also granted parole status to those who were denied refugee status. They could come and be here under parole status for 2 years, which could be renewed. And this was an effort really to get people to request arriving to the United States before they left their countries, trying to avoid them traveling in this way and experiencing the dangers of it. One of the other things that we have heard a lot about in recent years are the detention centers in which these individuals are kept as they arrive to the United States. Many of these detention centers are privately owned and are profit-making entities. And so these private companies actually benefit from an increase in border militarization in quote unquote capturing illegal immigrants crossing the border because they need these folks to be kept in their detention centers is the only way they can make any money. There are euphemisms used to avoid calling these detention centers prisons or jails. They are using a new terminology like family residential centers. In Texas, ICE was provided with a license that allows them to call detention centers for children childcare facilities. However, people who have studied these detention centers and the conditions that are actually experienced within them have talked about these sites being places of suicide attempts by both women and children. And so this is the kind of experience that not just Central American immigrants, but many immigrants coming across the border are experiencing these detention centers. And these are all of the situations that our current politicians and government officials have to confront and deal with in terms of trying to come up with immigration policies that are humane and at the same time consistent with our government policies around immigration. So this ends our lecture for this week. Hopefully this gives you a glimpse and understanding of the most recent group of Latinx individuals who have been coming now for over 40 years, what their conditions are like in the United States, why they have come, and the very specific kinds of experiences that they're having in their home countries that are pushing them to come to the United States and seeking asylum and safety. So here ends our lecture for this week. I look forward to your thoughts in the discussion post. Have a wonderful week.